Now again, if we drill a little bit deeper, we can now do a similar kind of growth accounting exercise as we did between the US and Europe. But now we put all the advanced countries together on the left-hand side of this chart, and we put all the emerging and developing economies together on the right-hand side of this chart. And again, we can look at where does that growth come from. So we already have seen on the left-hand side, and now Europe and the US and also Japan and other advanced economies are all together. Similar kind of picture from 1995 to 2005, pretty good growth. But then, since then, the growth has slowed, and it's particularly slowed as a result of the fact that the total factor productivity is kind of disappearing off the map. The right-hand side, the emerging and developing economies, actually accelerating their growth over time. A lot of that growth still coming from investment, not from productivity growth, but indeed from putting in a lot of more in terms of machinery and equipment to the economy, but also an acceleration in that total factor productivity growth. And there's a lot of debate now, what is exactly going on there? Some of that growth of total factor productivity in emerging economies is what we call churning. It basically means that there is a lot of, Eric referred to the fact there's a lot of productivity difference between more and less productive firms. And once these economies start to grow, a lot of the less productive economies are dying, and a lot of the more productive economies are coming in and growing faster. And that is, of course, driving some of that total factor productivity growth. But increasingly, as I mentioned already, it's also the result of the fact that the machinery and equipment is used more productively, more efficiently, and technology and innovation is a very important part of that. Now, let me move then to my sort of final point, because we basically looked so far at the top part of this chart. And this is all accounting. It's called growth accounting. So it's basically just take the numbers, do your work, take some underlying methodology here in order to do these kind of decompositions. But ultimately, the question, of course, is what can you do about this? What is it that is explaining these differences in productivity performance? And how can you sort of work around this from a perspective of either policy or from a perspective of business strategy? And that's really what the bottom part of this chart is telling you. The multi-factor productivity is largely driven by three major sources of productivity growth. The one that we are talking about mostly in this meeting is innovation and technological change. And in a sense, that's what the economic growth theory, the traditional economic growth theory, would be telling us. This productivity kind of residual, as it comes out of the accounting approach, is the result of technological progress. But there are two other things going on. First of all, there is on the left-hand side an issue of how companies are organized and how are companies dealing with their workforce. So this has to do with the human capital side of organizations. This is about motivation of your workforce, but it is also about competencies, about training, about skills, and it is about management quality. There's a lot of literature nowadays that is showing us that the relationship between management performance factors of companies and their productivity performance is making a huge, it's very strongly positively correlated. So that aspect we also clearly need to take into account. And then there's a middle segment, which is kind of the institutional environment. This is where the policymakers come in, because it does matter in what kind of environment companies are doing this. Is this a competitive environment in which the resources can go to the most productive companies? So it's the most productive companies that can actually tap the most productive resources. Or is the institutional environment rigid? Are there rigid labor markets? Are there product markets that are making it difficult for unproductive companies to die and for more productive companies to grow? So that is about markets, that is about institutions, and that is about regulations. Now, underlying all this, and that's where I sort of want to show you some final numbers on how important this is a concept of investment that we call the intangible investment. Investment is partly related to that capital that's up there, that blue bit, the machinery and the structures and the hardware. That's the kind of hard stuff that you can buy on the markets. And that's an important part of innovation. But the most important part of innovation comes from investment in the intangibles. Investment in the skills of the labor force, investment in research and development, but also investments in the sort of innovations that the organizations are doing, and even investments in the marketing and in the brands of the products and the services that companies are producing. That is probably a much more important aspect of the innovation contribution to productivity growth. Now, there are several ways to go about measuring that kind of intangibles. And again, Eric Brynjolfsson himself has been doing a lot of work on that from the company perspective. We have been doing a lot of work on that from the macroeconomic perspective. And last year, we actually produced a report which was funded by Microsoft on innovation and competitiveness, which is downloadable from our website at the conference board, where we actually tried to do a macroeconomic approach to how important these intangibles are for innovation and growth. So what are we talking about when we talk about the intangibles? Well, it's basically three major groups. We don't have the time to talk about this very extensively, but you could basically make the distinction between computerized information. So this is software, but it is also programs, computerized databases and systems and so on. It is scientific and creative property. So to some extent, that is the R&D in the way that we know it and the way it is measured, the scientific R&D. But it is also the more non-scientific, inventive and creative activities that aren't all that well measured. But if you really go deeply into the numbers, you can actually come up with some reasonably good estimates on that. And then the third group, which is a very large group, which is what we call economic competencies in a very broad term. That includes human capital that is created by the firm. The firm doesn't only get skilled people into their company boundaries, but that actually is also continuously working on improving the skills of their labor force, the lifelong learning, all sorts of programs that companies are doing. It is organizational capital, all the investments, all the expenditures that companies are making on trying to make the organization work better, make processes more smooth. And it is related to marketing and improvement of brand names. Now, this is, of course, a huge exercise in order to put some numbers on this. But together with our team and some people from academia who've been working on this quite intensively, we can actually come up now with some international comparisons on how important these intangibles are for individual economies. And some of the numbers here are really striking. So what you see here is these three categories, and we have now expressed them as investment in intangibles, expressed as a percentage of gross domestic product. So take the United States, and this is work from Corrado and Hulte and Sickle, who are actually working with us at the conference board. They're in academia. You can see for the United States that the total intangible investment that US business sector is making in the economy goes to about 12% of total GDP. That is actually more than the investment in the tangibles, in the machinery and the equipment and the hardware. So companies are making larger investments in intangibles in the United States as a percentage of GDP than they are making in terms of tangibles. And a lot of that is coming from innovative property, but in particular of this large group of economic competencies. If we move to the right, and I just added 5 countries here from Europe, probably we now have about estimates for about 20 countries, but I just take those 5. You can see that actually there are very substantial differences. If you take countries like, for example, Spain and Italy, they'll have a share of intangibles in the economy of perhaps only half of what it is in the advanced, in the case of the United States. But even France and Germany, the sort of share of intangibles in the economy will only be about 2/3 of what is in the US.